This is the first panel in the keynote as part of our MAHASSA program, which is Modern Art Histories in and across Africa, South and Southeast Asia. And I'm so delighted that we've been able to partner with the Getty Foundation, with Cornell University's Institute for Comparative Modernities, and with the Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. This is the second convening of this program, which brings together 21 emerging art historians who seek to look at art histories outside of European and North American frameworks, and we're so honored to be able to host part of this program here in Dhaka. So without further ado, I'll introduce our keynote speaker, who is Dr. Salah Hassan, and he's the Goldwin Smith Professor of African and African Diaspora, Art History and Visual Culture in Africana Studies and Research Center and the Department of the History of Art, and Director for the Institute of Comparative Modernities at Cornell. Hassan is an editor and founder of NKA, the Journal of Contemporary African Art, from the Duke University Press. He currently serves as a member of the editorial advisory board of Atlantica and the Journal of Curatorial Studies. He authored, edited, and co-edited several books, including Darfur and the Crisis of Governments, A Critical Reader, 2009, and Diaspora, Memory and Place, 2008, Unpacking Europe from 2001, which is actually one of my favorite books and a gift from Iftikhar in the last summit, and Authentic/Eccentric from 2001. His book, Ibrahim El Salahi, A Visionary Modernist, published in 2012 in conjunction with a retrospective of the Sudanese artist, was exhibited at Tate Modern in London in 2013. Thank you so much for being with us, Salah.
Well, thank you so much, Diana, for the gracious introduction. Thank you so much, Iftikhar, John, and the group of the MAHASSA for inviting me here for this talk, but also to be part of the seminar. Sorry that I think what I will do is just to start with the presentation, because I can't do both, and maybe we'll end with the film. The video, which didn't work at the beginning, okay, it's working. Just play it. It's okay. I just would like to begin with this, so to avoid the mess moving between different, programs. Yeah, played. No. The film. Yeah. It's a film by the South African artist Bernie Sell, and it's called Seeking Refuge. I just using it as a prelude to the lecture itself because it touches on issues of migration, movement, diaspora, and all of these issues. And specifically the most recent diaspora, which is the subject of the talk itself, thinking about the idea of Afropolitanism. Okay, thank you so much, Iftikhar. Let me begin by briefly summarizing the central issues and arguments I hope to raise in my talk today. The field of contemporary African and African diaspora art and culture is currently riddled by two paradoxes. First, in Africa and its diaspora, we are witnessing a burgeoning of creative energy and an increasing visibility of artists in the international arts arena. Yet this energy and visibility has not been matched by a parallel regime of art criticism that lives up to the levels of their work. Second, we find, as a second contradiction, we find a rising interest in exhibiting and collecting works by contemporary African and African diaspora artists among Western museums, as well as private and public collections. However, this growing interest has been taking place within an extremely xenophobic environment of anti-immigration legislation and the closing of borders to the West, and a callous disregard for African life. In this lecture, I hope to address also the need to an innovative framework that is capable of critically unpacking these paradoxes, and to offer a critical analysis of contemporary African and African diaspora artistic production. In doing so, I wish to assert the importance of movement, mobility, and transiency in addressing issues of contemporary African artists and culture production. My focus will be on the use of the term Afropolitan, which has made its way into African artistic and literary discourses as a crossover from the fashion and popular culture arena. In thinking about the usefulness of Afropolitanism, I revisit the notion of cosmopolitanism in relation to the entanglement of Africa and the West and its reconfiguration at the intersection of modernity and post-coloniality. In June 2011, the Victoria and Albert Museum, that's the V&A in London, organized a highly publicized evening named Friday Afropolitan. The event was intended to explore African photography, fashion, and identity in celebration of a major evening entitled, of a major exhibition entitled Figures and Fiction, Contemporary South African Photography. The event was dubbed as a celebration of image makers who captured the excitement, optimism, and a sense of freedom of post-independence African nations from the 1960s onward. The event included music from a South African pop musician, a fashion show entitled Afropolitan, a textile workshop, and most interesting for my purpose here today, a panel discussion on what it means to be an Afropolitan. The evening event was later described by one of the panel participants, that is the Kenyan blogger, Lulu Kituloto, as follows, and I quote, "There are moments where I feel totally at home, living in the UK with a Kenyan passport and a visa with an expiry date. That doesn't happen all that often. But it happened on Friday night at the Victoria and Albert Museum, no less. The Afropolitan Friday late saw this world-renowned museum transformed into a celebration of contemporary African art and culture. The content, the ambience, and the crowd made for the dubbed kind of beautiful, vibrant, uplifting experience that warms the soul as much as being of feeling at home." This statement speaks to the condition of what I call temporary permanence, which has been literally and visually captured in the work of several contemporary African and non-African artists too. The Albanian artist Adrian Paci works entitled, which literally translates into the Center for Temporary Permanence, shows an airport as a metaphorical location where people are stuck in a permanent temporary situation. Men and women are crowding an air stair, yet there is no plane in sight, or there is one that is not just landing. The stairs form an island in a concrete waste, suggesting that air travel is not for everyone despite the global economic inequalities which force non-Western population to migrate. Paci shows the harshness and absurdity of uncertain socioeconomic realities and the surreal nature of government institutions such as the migrant detention centers in Europe. Dysfunctional Dysfunctional Family from 1999, the multimedia installation by Yinka Shonibare, the London-based Nigerian British artist and proud MBA, or MBE, a title bestowed on him by the Queen of England herself, is a playful exploration of the status, alienation, and multiculturalism as experienced by Africans in the West. This functional family consists of 4 large, as you've seen, stuffed mannequins of a stereotypical space alien family that look like oversized toys. The artist here uses patterned fabric as a metaphor for colonial relations and the post-colonial condition, unveiling in the process the notion of identity as a construct. At the same time, he uses the figures of the alien consciously to play on the notion of the foreign or alien in today's social fabric. I mean, just remember, the green card in the United States is known as a resident alien. Both Kitololo's statement and Patchy and Shonibare works have captured the major paradox and contradiction at the heart of the status of diasporic Africans, including artists living in Europe and the West at large, including also, of course, North America. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, we witness a growing number of exhibitions and events celebrating the talent of contemporary African artists, writers, musicians, and other creative figures living in the West or moving in and out of it. On the other hand, the press and media continue to carry or sometimes deliberately ignore the tragic images of African youth, men and women, who have perished trekking through the deserts of North African countries in transit to Europe. And as we all have been made painfully aware in the past several months or years, that thousands upon thousands of others, meaning Africans who drowned and again sometimes deliberately left to face such a tragic destiny while journeying on makeshift boats across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. Those who have made it alive have encountered a new fortress of draconian laws in a continent that have devoted its energies and legislation to its security and curbing immigration. I mean, the latest development in of course, Italy specifically knows how to create that contradiction between the law of the sea and the law of the land that's created. So, and I quote here William Sperling, who's saying that whose economic and political interests are served by the celebrated permeability of certain borders depends on who is crossing them and for what purpose, and how might these same borders still be used to sustain social hierarchies and relations of power. Hence, in Europe, for instance, we are witnessing not only the highly politicized erosion of many of the internal borders within the European Union, but also simultaneous production of highly policed external borders between the EU and its non-European neighbors, especially in the eastern edges of the European Union and along its Mediterranean border. I mean, of course, the Brexit might complicate this further, but it wouldn't really affect the issue of immigration. Third again is this devastating background. The event of the V&A and many others like it pose a contradiction that warrants our attention. The celebration of Afropolitans, supposedly free-spirited and young diasporic African artists, writers and musicians and other creative talent is part of a larger shift, an interesting phenomenon in the contemporary art world. For example, in September 2011, the Houston Museum of African American Culture organized a symposium entitled Africans in America, the New Beat of Afropolitan. The goal of the symposium was to mark, and I quote here, the rise of new cultural influences brought to America and the world by way of fascinating young and creative cosmopolitan Africans, immigrant, so-called Afropolitans, end of quote. The metaphor, of course, of the wave or travel by sea is haunting, given its association with the horrors of the Middle Passage, as well as the new Middle Passage across the Mediterranean, where the sea, like the Atlantic Ocean, has become a graveyard for the thousands who die crossing the shores to the Lampedusa or other ports of southern Europe. But it is a metaphor that doesn't resonate well with how most Afropolitans actually travel. That is by air, not by sea, helping to underscore the ugly reality that the outward recent infatuation with the Afropolitans obscure. Both the V&A and the Houston Museum of African American Culture were preceded by the Studio Museum series of exhibitions that started in April 2008, organized around the issue of flow, a major exhibition focused on young diasporic African artists. Dubbed the survey by new works of 20 emerging African artists, Flow came on the heels of two highly successful landmark exhibitions at the Studio Museum, Freestyle in 2001 and Frequency in 2005, that launched the career of a generation of African American and African diasporic artists into the international arena and the global art market. Both exhibitions not only illustrated the individuality and complexity of the works produced by this young generation, but also challenged the art world to think critically and examine its assumptions about contemporary African American and African diasporic art. It is true that this younger generation of the so-called Afropolitans, it is true that this younger generation, so-called Afropolitan artists, are remarkable for their energy, the richness of their work, and the variety of media with which they engage, including imaginary architecture, photography, video, large-scale sculpture, figurative painting, and site-specific installation. This burgeoning creativity exists in the face of abysmal health conditions, disastrous wars, increasing dependency on aid, and in many African countries, total economic collapse of failure. Anthropologist Hudita Mustafa has characterized this dilemma of the paradox, what she calls creativity in the context of crisis. But it has to be critically analyzed or properly explicated. The lack of a corpus of art criticism and reception of this paradox should not lead us to Afropolitanism, to Afro-pessimism, what came to know as Afro-pessimism, but rather to a renewed understanding and appreciation of the creativity and transnational circulation of these artists who are subject to such difficult conditions. Of course, the picture is much more complex. There have been positive development in places such as Egypt, South Africa, or Morocco, or Tunisia, where galleries and workshops and traditions of art collecting and criticism have started to emerge. The critical historical role of ongoing African-based biennials such as the Dakar, Cairo, when it's enacted, Cape Town, and of course Johannesburg, both disappeared, should be acknowledged. The serious lack of publications, periodicals, and magazines on the visual art of the continent and diaspora, and the equally serious crisis in art criticism, research, and education have been partially addressed by positive initiatives such as, and I'm showing here some of the initiatives that actually disappeared. Some of them still exist, like Gallery, that was out of Zimbabwe, and then Revue Noir, that was out of Paris, that also disappeared. There are some existing initiatives, African Art, which is the oldest in the field, and then Black Renaissance Noir out of NYU, initiated by, these, of course, and then it's called Inca. That's not just self-propaganda, but this is the latest issue. Actually, it won a major award of the MLA Association. And then there is Art South Africa, Critical Intervention. There is Artrop, which is also one of the old web-based magazines, and Savvy, which is based in Berlin, and it's more than just a journal. It is also a major initiative and a space. And then Contemporary And, thank you so much. And then Contemporary And, which is a forum for international art that is led by initiative of two young art critics and curators. And then, of course, there is the commercial aspect of it, is 154 Contemporary Art Fair that has traveled to New York, Morocco, and started a series of publications. So this will lead me to think a little bit, or to talk more about the general state of research on contemporary and modern African art. That is definitely has improved a great deal in the last 2 decades, and a number of well-researched books, dissertations, exhibitions, and catalogs have been produced. Contemporary art history have started to enjoy some recognition, albeit on a smaller scale than accorded to their Western counterpart, Several exhibitions and a few texts produced during the last 3 decades have effectively captured aspects of the complexity of the contemporary African art scene through interdisciplinary and visual culture approaches. These include exhibitions and companion texts, which I really think of as fundamental, some of which they're really good, not because I'm also involved in some of them, but they are also really changed the field and shifted the direction of research and alerted museum directors and curators from the West to really pay attention seriously to art. 7 Stories is one of them, which is part of an initiative in London in 1995. The biggest impact, of course, is the show of the short century. Many people in this audience knows Okwe and Weizur, and what a loss for the art world. But definitely his impact, not his documenta and other shows, but within the field of contemporary African art, it was the short century independence and liberation movement in Africa. And that in the academy, wherever I teach or lecture, everyone pointed to how that show is specifically, and the book and the publication, which is a huge volume, also shifted the terrain. There were initiatives in Venice, authentic, eccentric. This is just part of it, of the show itself, shots from it. There is the show by Simon Njame, Africa Remix, and so forth. So, and then there are other works that's called the work of Okwe on photography, Snap Judgment, Insight, Chico Okeke, Who Knows Tomorrow. There are other shows like Looking Both Ways, Fiction of Authenticity, and so forth. So with varying degrees of success, these exhibitions have provided critical frameworks for interrogating the contemporary, especially African modernism and postmodernism, by engaging diverse media, including photography, architecture, music, theater, fabric, fashion, posters, literature, and so forth. Unlike earlier exhibitions or texts on African modern art, these have transcended traditional boundaries. And this is very important, especially in viewing what Africa is in the visual art, by incorporating popular culture, what African art is, but also geographically, as a genre and geographically, by incorporating popular culture, situating the visual in relation to the discursive, and overcoming typical institutional separation of art, architecture, film, and video and new media, as I mentioned earlier. Above all, it's important to mention that these exhibitions challenge all representation of Africa in art history by breaking down the artificial boundaries, and this is really very important, between Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa, between the so-called Arab Africa and the Black Africa. They critique many of the essentializing tendencies that have plagued the field since its inception, especially in the Francophone arena, where the idea of Black Africa versus so-called white Africa still persists, which is what I call within African studies the darkest Africa syndrome, which is, of course, residues of the colonial study of Africa. So the recent paradigmatic shift we have been gradually witnessing among Western-based museums of modern art and contemporary art has shepherded a series of initiatives that revise their major policies of collecting and exhibiting. This has been characterized by a move towards a more genuine multicultural outlook that embraces much more global art historical perspective. So the latest initiative at the Tate Modern on African art is a case, although it depended also on African funding that didn't continue. But I'm pleased to see major shift that causes, of course, shift in the, like the recent MoMA reinstallation, like also what has been created a lot of fuss re-envisioning the introductory courses at Yale, which I don't know what the fuss is about. If we think about Cornell, we have changed and canceled the whole idea of 101, and as I call it, from rock to pop type of introductory courses, and towards a much more global, diverse introductory courses of the art that are embracing of all the diversity in the world. However, looking at the overall picture from the African continent, we find cause for significant concern, as it points towards a serious intellectual decline when compared with the optimism of independence and decolonization movement and the rise in the 1960s and 70s of a generation of modernists in literature, art, such as Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Leopold Sedar Senghor, Wole Soyinka, who combined artistic, and this is very important, who combined artistic and literary production with serious critical writings. Like, you don't see that kind of intellectual today. Moreover, with few exceptions of the current burgeoning of artistic and literary production, as evidenced by the visual and literary work of the so-called Afropolitan, have not been matched with critical discursive writing that can help elucidate their complexity. So, lamenting such condition, Tejmula Olaniyan insightfully, who's the late, actually I would say the late, is a wonderful colleague who just passed away recently, who taught at Wisconsin Madison for a long time, and he's among the few really who had real serious theoretical contributions and insight. So he insightfully observed that in contemporary Africa, cultural creativity far outstrips cultural criticism, happily and sadly. Happily because the continent is not at least losing out on both creative and critical production. Sadly because the condition for the training of intellectuals and culture critics are far less than adequate. And because an overall healthy development of cultural creativity, the type that continually breaches accepted boundaries and invent new forms and suggest new meanings, depend on a robust interaction between talented artists and discerning critics, between the creative and the critical imagination. What we now need is an innovative framework that can facilitate the critical unpacking, drawing on a series of critical reflection on the condition of contemporary art production. Based on my own work and others, what follows, and that's what I will mention, what follows is intended, and I want you to take it as a gesture towards outline of a such critical framework that I cannot definitely elaborate on much because of the time here. At first, it's important to understand the discourses and theories that inform the artistic production of these artists, and to investigate the techniques, media, genres, and visual vocabularies they deploy. All the artists discussed in this presentation later on are well-versed in contemporary visual culture, specifically discourses of postmodernism and postcolonialism, as well as the languages and techniques of contemporary global art, as evident in their emphasis on conceptualism, documentary, and the archive, and photography. Their work must be understood within the parameters of such global discourses and practices. However, the intersection of these discourses with race, gender, and sexuality, and other existential experiences, and I may just say a framework that's more towards an intersectional one, are perhaps among the most striking aspects of art created by contemporary artists throughout Africa and the diaspora. Here it's helpful to use the discourse of comparative modernity to reread modernism, and by extension postmodernism, outside the West as a performative act translated and staged through difference. Second, it is important to interrogate their art, and I'm meaning here these artists, contemporary African artists in general, as transnational product that can be best understood within the theorization of the diaspora. Such diasporic framework, as Robin Kelly, the American historian, eloquently argues, have, and I quote here, profound implications, not only for our understanding of the Black world, but for the way we write the history of the modern world, of the modern West itself. End of quote. As he further explains, and I quote here, the making of the African diaspora was as much the product of the West as it was of internal development, as it was of internal development in Africa and the Americas. At the same time, racial capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism, the key forces responsible for creating modern African diaspora, could not shape African cultures without altering Western cultures, end of quote. And this is really very important in really understanding the West and the non-West, because there is a lot in the West that is of the non-West already. Third, the movement of Africans across continent is likely to continue deep into the 21st century as economic and political circumstances forge large scale of migrations of people, including artists, intellectuals, from African nations to the West. Hence, it's important to locate the practice of these artists within this historical continuum. Within this historical, sorry, I'm just losing here because of the light. Hence, it's important to locate the practice of these artists within this historical continuum without neglecting individuality or the particular circumstance and experiences that shape the work. Tracing the genealogy of ideas, concept, and movement, including negritude and Pan-Africanism, which diasporic Africans, intellectuals, played essential role, recalling here, and that's important to mention briefly, works such as Brent Hayes Edward of Columbia University, the book that's called Black Internationalism, or Paul Gilroy, The Black Atlantic. So these movements have been crucial to the development of African modernism and the ideology of return, and in shaping the intellectual artistic production of African, of people or artists of African descent in Africa and the diaspora. You notice I always talk about African and the diaspora because I find it important to think of Africa as a geographic, presence rather than, as a historic presence rather than a geographic entity. Finally, as Edward Said argued, an exploration, and I quote here, an exploration of the history, formation, and sociology of the Western metropolis, especially in the 1930s and 40s, is even more revealing of the hybrid nature of such spaces. In the interwar period, the strong presence in Paris, London, and Rome, and other European capitals of students, writers, and artists from colonized territories in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean challenged the long-held perceptions about modernity and modernism. Their intellectual, as Said argues, their intellectual production, as Said argues, and anti-imperialist writing are essential to any reconsideration of what constitutes global modernity as it overlaps with the production of their contemporary European counterpart. There are copious examples of how African and Caribbean immigrants, writers, poets, and artists have laid claim to the space of Western metropolis and reworked ideas of exile, nation, and citizenship in ways that defy any easy readings of otherness. Most recent interrogation of immigrant literary and artistic production in the context of contemporary Western culture further critique the sense of the discrete and self-contained cultural boundaries. Rather than locating the production of the artist in a space of in-betweenness, which is typical of the analysis of Western art critics of the work of many non-Western artists, is either hybrid or in-betweenness, we argue instead, or I argue instead, for a new understanding of contemporary African diasporic art and cultural labor and serious rethinking of its spatial configuration. So, this is Kelly's. So Afropolitan. I'm just jumping to this in terms of trying to understand the genealogy of the term, which I just suddenly introduced. In gesturing towards a theoretical framework with which to comprehend the breadth and depth of contemporary African diasporic artists, I recall an earlier moment that triggered my interest in the term Afropolitan and its potential for embodying a sense of cosmopolitanism as an existential experience of young contemporary African artists. When I was invited to contribute an essay to the catalog of Flow, that was in the early 2000s. At the time, I knew little about the origins and the uses of the term Afropolitan, but thanks to the above-mentioned invitation, I grew curious and I researched it and I continue to do so. And I'm still, puzzled by it. I read Tai Selassie article. Tai Selassie is a very well-known Nigerian, Ghanaian novelist who's based in Germany. Wrote an essay on the net. It's called Bye Bye Babar, or Who is the Afropolitan? Many, among other relevant pieces, of course, she wrote and found the term, found the term Afropolitan to be compelling effort towards self-definition and self-articulation. A posting on the internet described the young breed of Africans as following. The newest generation, and I'm quoting here, of African immigrants coming soon or collected already at a law firm, camp, lab, jazz lounge near you. You will know you will know us by our funny blend of London fashion, New York jargon, African ethics, and academic successes. Some of us are ethnic mixes, that is Ghanaian, African American, Nigerian, and Swiss. Others are merely cultural mods. American accent, European effect, African ethos. Most of us are multilingual, in addition to English and a romantic or two. We understand indigenous tongue and speak a few urban vernaculars. There is at least one place on the African continent to which we tie ourselves, or sense of self, be it a nation state, Ethiopia, a city, Ibadan, or an auntie's kitchen. Then there is the GA8 or 2 or 3 that we know like the backs of our hands, and the various institutions that know us for our famed focus. We are Afropolitan, not citizen, but Africans of the world. In interrogating, end of quote, of course, in interrogating this new term, Afropolitan, we must think of the complex nature of the African diaspora and whether such concept encompasses its experiences or limits them to the artistic arenas of influence and privilege. Afropolitan, as suggested by the composite term, is where cosmopolitan meet African. The term speaks to morphing identity, fluid enough to encompass new breed of diasporic, culturally or ethnically mixed Africans who came of age or grew up outside Africa, but still move in and out of the continent. It speaks of a cosmopolitanism and a sense of belonging in the metropolis. In most cases, the term Afropolitan assumed the Western metropolis as the base for parents of this new breed, sometimes uncomfortably suggests that the cosmopolitan in Afropolitan is derivative of the West rather than African. At the same time, the term seems to have taken on a life of its own, become part of a language of fashion advertisement, especially in pop culture and marketing in Africa and communities of immigrant black youth in Europe and North America. All these observations require further investigation of the term and questioning of its potential or validity. Interestingly, as reported by Jamin Ohon Ravioli, in a view essay of the panel at the VNA, that no consensus was reached on the question, what is the Afropolitan? Instead, the verdict at the end was, the Afropolitan means different things to different people, as quoted by him. For some, African is more important element of the term, for others, cosmopolitanism. However, there are consequences of an Afropolitan in someone, the acquiescence of that an Afropolitan is someone who vests part of his or her identity in the African continent. Since Haile Selassie launched the term, Afropolitan has taken a life of its own, gradually filtering into discourses of contemporary cultural studies, including visual and literary domains, and has started to enjoy an array of uses, definitions among prominent African scholars and critical thinkers. So in an essay entitled Afropolitanism, Achille Mbembe distinguishes between three African paradigms in African discourses of literature and art, philosophy, which according to him range from anti-colonial nationalist discourse to those influenced by Marxism and in the variation of African socialism, in addition to the different manifestations of Pan-Africanism, which, as he argues, privileges two types of solidarity, a racial and transnational solidarity and an international anti-imperialist solidarity. According to Mbembe, these three paradigms have become institutionalized and much ossified to a degree that has rendered them a bit useless or less encompassing, especially in a consideration of a world that is increasingly mobile and transient. This, as Mbembe argues, has its bearing on lingering questions of citizenship and in providing new answers to questions such as who is African, who is not. It is in this context, and in contrast to what Mbembe calls the nativist reflex, which derives on glorifying difference and diversity, that he proposes a redefinition of Afropolitan or Afropolitanism that highlights its cosmopolitan potential by pointing to the cultural, historical, and aesthetic sensibility that underlie the term that underlie the term Afropolitan. And as he says, awareness of the interweaving of the here and there, that is, as he suggested, that the Afropolitan recalibrated as such, the presence of the elsewhere in the here and vice versa, the relativization of primary roots and membership, and the way of embracing with full knowledge of the facts, strangeness, foreignness, remoteness, the ability to recognize one in the face of that of a foreigner and make the most of the traces of remoteness in closeness, to domesticate the unfamiliar, to work with what seems to be opposites. End of quote. In such a case, Afropolitanism is not the same as Pan-Africanism or negritude. It is, as Mbembe argued, and I quote here, an aesthetic and a particular poetic of the world. It is a way of being in the world, refusing on principle any form of victim identity, end of quote, which does not negate an awareness of the injustice and violence that have been inflicted on the continent and its people throughout its modern history. Afropolitanism, in this sense, becomes a specific political and cultural stand vis-a-vis issues of nationalism, race, and difference. In the aforementioned, in a foreword to a recent edited volume of essays entitled Negotiating Afropolitanism, Essays on Borders and Spaces in Contemporary African Literature and Folklore, Simon Gikandi provides similar definition of what seems or what means to be an Afropolitan and what Afropolitanism as a new type of consciousness entails, especially in the field of African literary and cultural studies. As Gikandi argues, to be an Afropolitan is a new phenomenology of Africanness and a way of being African in the world. It is, as he further explained, a way of rethinking African identities as rooted in a certain locales but transcendent of them. Gikandi emphasizes the articulation of hybridity that is distinct from earlier conceptions in which the term hybridity was riddled with cultural anxieties and psychological divisions, where the life of Africans were imagined in tragic terms and as tormented between cultures and languages and tradition. For Gikandi, the new formulation of hybridity in the context of Afropolitanism provides an opportunity to reimagine a much more hopeful way of Africans living in the context of obvious crisis. Most importantly, in celebrating Afropolitanism, Gikandi remains watchful of the negative potential of transnationalism in emphasizing, and I quote here, the deep cultural anxieties that often makes diaspora sites of cultural nationalism and ethnic chauvinism, end of quote. So is Afropolitan the answer, which is the last segment here? In thinking about the usefulness of the term Afropolitan, it's important to revisit the notion of cosmopolitanism itself. Since the 1990s, multiple cultural and geopolitical factors have warranted a rethinking of cosmopolitanism across the broad range of the humanities and social sciences. These include the persistence of nationalism in the rise of ethnocentrism since 9/11, in which, of course, the increased globalization and transnationalism and the resurgence of the idea of multiple belonging and hybrid identities. This is coupled with the return of sheer colonial violence, of course, in the context of the so-called war on terror, and we continue to witness, and as we continue to witness in the context of Iraq, Palestine, Afghanistan, and of course, Yemen and many other places. In the context of Africa, the war on terror can be seen in recent events in Mali, Niger, and Algeria, are cases in point which further endanger the routes of migration of Africans with the complicity of many West and North African governments. This is really related to the work of Bernie Seal, because with all these security arrangements with the United States and with the European Union, paying many African governments to curb immigration, the routes of immigration across the coast of Western Africa that used to be safe are pushed further into the sea. Hence, what you see in bodies floating because Africans needed to reach another place, which is basically the Canary Island at the recent, the closest European border through which they can seek asylum. And that is because of the nature of currents and so forth, endangered many lives. However, I'm not interested in reiterating the vast literature on cosmopolitanism, but only as it impacts the discussion of the validity of the term Afropolitan, and more specifically within the visual arena. Hence, cosmopolitanism is discussed here in relationship to the entanglement of Africa and the West historically, culturally and artistically, and how this relationship has been reconfigured in the intersection of modernity and decolonization. In that sense, African modernities and African role in the making of Western modernities and in reshaping the West itself are also ways worth investigating. This will provide an opportunity to challenge the Eurocentric hold on the ways in which the debate on modernity has been cast and how it's impacted contemporary art in terms of hierarchies, classification, practice, exhibition, and exhibitionary regimes. In this context, it is important to understand how the unfolding of Western imperialism, inherently violent relationship with Africa and other parts of the non-Western world, continues to be determined by continue to be detrimental to migration flows from Africa and other parts of the world to Europe, and to the ensuing debates about national European or Western identities and immigration policies. Decolonization have further complicated these debates by ushering new geopolitical dislocation and the rise of new international order, which in turn continue to challenge and expose the insufficiency of classic concepts and definitions of modernity, culture, art, and politics. Above all, colonization afforded us the potential of decolonization, not colonization, afforded us the potential of rethinking modernity and contemporaneity beyond their Eurocentric stronghold. In that sense, rethinking Afropolitanism through the prism of debate about cosmopolitanism becomes an urgent task. This could be done by invoking the potential of cosmopolitanism as a notion that implies possibilities of mutual coexistence and living with difference. Cosmopolitanism is conceived here to indicate the need for members of any community to imagine entities other than their own locales or national boundaries that would be more inclusive on a global scale. Hence, cosmopolitanism is perceived as a metaphor for mobility, migrancy, and coexistence with difference, and in opposition to parochialism, xenophobia, and fixity and limited notions of sovereignty. Cosmopolitanism is also perceived as a pursuit of peace through developing a strong sense of ethics and moral obligation towards other human beings everywhere. To be more specific, the emphasis should be on the anti-hegemonic and anti-homogenizing potential of cosmopolitanism. In this regard, one should emphasize the need for opposition to Western imperial tendencies and transnational capital and their corollary neoliberal economic policies, yet it is precisely these factors that continue to control visibility and the market in the art world. And the recent uprising from Chile to Lebanon are witness to this, but it's also the rise of the market in the art world in the West is also another aspect of this new liberal politics. In rethinking cosmopolitanism, I have in mind Edouard Glissot's brilliant articulation of creolization through his idea of poetics of relation, where the concept of relation could be used to meditate on new meanings of diaspora, globalization, chaos, violence, equality, and justice. In this sense, the poetics of relations, or of relation, or the poetics of relation, emerges as a moment of awakening in the world's imagination, whereby common grounds between seemingly disparate cultures and geography could be obtained. I mean, in a nutshell, it's celebration of difference rather than thinking of difference as something negative. In this sense, although originally the concept was articulated, meaning the poetic of relation, in the context of the Caribbean, creolization is potentially helpful in thinking about new forms of identity, such as Afropolitanism, through the process of communal interactions of different peoples, of people, ethnicities, hybridity, and intermixture. In this context, one find it useful to rethink Afropolitanism crossover to the artistic arena. But in speaking of this generation of the so-called Afropolitan artists, I can't help but compare them, or compare the Afropolitans to an earlier generation of African diasporic intellectuals, writers, and artists, Frantz Fanon, Leopold Sédar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, among others, who in the process of inhabiting the Western metropolis have shared our thinking of Western modernity and postmodernity. I mean, largely by their critique of modernity. If you read MS's letter, Discourse on Colonialism, or letter to Maurice Thorez, you will see at that time someone in the 1950s critiquing Western universalism. More recent work by Stuart Hall, among others, on the concept of diaspora, migration, and identity politics resonate with the idea of the Afropolitan. This raises the potential to rethink Afropolitanism in relation to whole concept of new ethnicities and his important effort to do away with the periphery, to rethink Afropolitanism in relation to whole concept of new ethnicities and his important effort to do away with the center-periphery dichotomy in artistic and cultural production. And I'm quoting here, "The world is moving outward and can no longer be structured in terms of center-periphery relation. It has to be defined in terms of a set of intersecting or interesting centers which are both different from and related to one another." If you think about where important movements are being made, sometimes they happen in the center, but the most exciting artists are those who live simultaneously in the center and the periphery. I mean, you know, the presence of many now people who never showed in maybe Dhaka Summit or Sharjah Biennial and others from the West is of course a welcoming phenomena. But it's interesting how it's just happening now where the West sometimes needed to recalibrate a sense of collection. Galleries also do the same. It's a chance for them to discover new artists and market them. Havana Biennial used to play this role. And the stories of many artists like Cho and others is typical of that kind of phenomena, but it's just now becoming more increasing. Take, for example, his assertion, and I'm here referring to Stuart Hall, his assertion that despite profound inequalities and the absolute hegemonic centralizing primacy of Western modernity and capitalism, artistic practice is not being homogenized. For Hall, good art can happen at the center, but the most exciting art is being made by those who live simultaneously in the center at the periphery. Hall's articulation provides a glimpse of the challenge and rewards of theorizing about art movement originating outside the West or created by non-Western artists in the West, considering the long history of exclusion and the entrenched stranglehold of Eurocentrism on art historical discourse. For sure, the works of majority of contemporary African artists are manifestations of cosmopolitanism in the visual art, which entails, as Maria Fernandez argues, the processes of juxtaposition, amalgamation, and translation of visual materials from various cultural traditions, which have the purpose of bringing home aspects of the outside world and projecting elements of the vernacular on outward. Point to Walter Mignolo's work on cosmopolitanism, Fernandez further argues, and I quote here, "Patrons, artists, and publics assigns to these products certain values, frequently linked with hierarchies of economic and political power. Thus, cosmopolitanism in visual culture must be theorized in the light of geopolitics." End of quote. Thus, one must push for a new understanding of the work of these artists, and by extension, the work of other diasporic Africans as part of the process of constant translation and production, constant translations and product of what she calls an informed selection that entails invention, synthesis, and transformation of diverse tradition, not just naive imitations are often suggested. Yet I wonder whether by using the term Afropolitan, we restrict ourselves to the middle class and offsprings of well-to-do African diasporic Africans, of course. Allow me to pause for a moment and to circle back to the contradictions I posed at the beginning of this lecture. Here, a few questions or questioning will help. So isn't our fascination with the jet-setting Afropolitan artists in part linked to the horror of the bodies that wash up on the shores of the Mediterranean? In privileging this very elite diaspora and its movement and productions, we are to imagine a borderless world when in fact we are witnessing the rise of fortress Europe and America? In answering such complex questions, I find it necessary to delve directly into the nature of artistic production of the so-called Afropolitans. 3 examples of these artists of this generation will suffice. The Moroccan, not the Mediterranean, Paris-based artist, Bushra Khalili, who is here among us in the front seat, illustrates the reality of migration. In this work, which is basically a video installation, 8 immigrants describe the routes they have traveled on a world map. These journeys underscores the difficulties in confining people to cartographic contours. Taking their experiences as a starting point and not as exception, Bushra challenges our conventional view of maps in a different way by forcing us to confront the realities of migration and mobility. There is a lot to discuss about the piece, but I will jump a little bit. In her hauntingly beautiful and yet surreal series of photographs and video installations, you've seen the video yourself, and this is installations of it, Seeking Refuge by the Cape Town-based artist Bernie Sells, reenact and retraces the journey of many West African migrants who land on the shores of the Canary Island and other European shores. Shot on the volcanic island of Lanzarote, the video and related photographs situate the artist within the stark, beautiful landscape that is manifestly inhospitable, yet within which people have found ways to survive. Sel wanders barefoot. I think I skipped that, you've seen it. Sel wanders barefoot, almost bleeding, finding shelter in shallow cavities in the soil, among the vines, or in a stranded boat. As the description of the video states, and I quote here, the elements specific to Lanzarote's landscape, the black volcanic soil, the red cochineal dye staining her feet and hands are of critical importance. In walking and posing, she embraces them, bearing the physical and emotional traces impressed on her along the way. And lastly, these are really arbitrary selection. There are so many other artwork that one could select. And lastly, the Angolan artist Kolwanji Kiehenda, The Merchant of Venice, is a work which pays homage to William Shakespeare's play set in the late century Venice. Of course, it is a partly well-known anti-Semitic, of course, novel with stereotypical views of Jews. But nevertheless, the figure in the work set against the interior of Venice Institute of Sciences, Arts and Letters is a Senegalese musician who, like many other immigrants, is forced to accept whatever job comes his way just to survive, even at the cost of the proverbial of the proverbial, which is used, of course, in the play itself, the novel, pound of flesh. A pound of flesh. This work could have been photographed in New York or another European city where African immigrants have to dodge the authorities to make a living selling fake high fashion goods. These artists remain particularly conscious of the continued foreign involvement in the African continent, as well as persisting systems of racial classification established under colonialism. Most interesting, despite their relatively young age, and most born during the early days of independence and post-liberation era, they are strikingly aware and responsive to the colonial aftermath. From the legacy of the apartheid to the marginalization of Africa in an increasingly globalized market economy. They are also creatively engaged with the real imaginary or virtual effect of the transnational movement of goods, cultures, people. In these critically informed artworks, we can begin to see a dialogue emerging between the privileged Afropolitans and their more numerous and the privileged counterparts. It is at this juncture one can one can make the argument that in most of the current discussion on Afropolitanism, the idea of cosmopolitanism is always routed through the West. The uneven, predictable nature of the art scene in Africa has made it difficult for the continent or other parts of the global South to be reference points in defining the cosmopolitanism of the Afropolitan. An exploration of the South-South cosmopolitanism, and that's very important to think about in the era of decolonization, should be the next frontier for interrogation of Afro-cosmopolitanism. Otherwise, it is still the West that endows African with their cosmopolitanism. Instead, the era of decolonization provides plenty of examples when this was not the case, such as the Mbare Club, an experimental arts and drama workshop in Ibadan, Nigeria, initiated by the German expatriate Uli Bayer, Wally Shawinka Achebe, Gerald Fellet Chikaya, Jacob Lawrence, Dennis Williams, Ibrahim al-Salahi, among others who were integral to the Mbare Club in early days of their career, and who have since also emerged as artists and writers whose work have made profound impact on modern African art and literature. The development of the Mbare Club interdisciplinary orientation was among the most productive and provocative episodes in the history of modern art, modern African art. In addition, the Pan-African Festival of the 1960s, the 1970s, Dakar 1966, Algiers 69, Lagos Festac Festival in 1977 have served as an incubator for many productive ideas in the art and literature and performing arts. However, it is the current crisis and failure of the post-colonial state that has led to the near total closure of the possibility of inter-African cosmopolitanism or South-South cosmopolitanism, while creating bifurcated external engagement with the West, one by land and sea, the migrants who perish, and the one on the air, the Afropolitan. In addition, how can we, or should we, distinguish the so-called Afropolitan from their counterpart in the black communities, that is African Americans in the United States, blacks in and people of the Caribbean in origin in England, or other communities of color, Asians in England or Canada, who were in the Western metropolis before the rise of the so-called Afropolitans. Serious scholarship on the youth culture of the Black Atlantic has only just begun. As a matter of fact, Afropolitans are indebted to other black communities in the diaspora for their earlier struggles for civil rights and social economic justice, and the relative comfort with ease, and the ease with which they move inside and outside of the West. In other ways, we are indebted to African Americans for their struggle and for all the shift in the Constitution and the democratic rights in the United States. Other, which made the US and many Western places more hospitable to such groups. Other questions also arise. Does the term Afropolitan speak to complex experience of the thousands of young Africans who have rushed to the West for employment or better lives? What about the sons and daughters of Senegalese and other West Africans in New York and Paris, or the Algerians, Moroccan, and other North African immigrated to cities in France, Spain, and the Netherlands decades earlier? As many are absorbed into the underclass of the Western world, I doubt whether they share any affinity with the seemingly privileged Afropolitan. Some of these communities suggest a very complex picture of diaspora and form tightly knit communities, such as the West Africans in Harlem, simultaneously living inside and outside the West. Their link to the homeland are very strong, as seen in their respective shops and mosques, and in the strong culture of murids and marabouts. As African-American historian Earl Lewis reminds us, the entire Atlantic world, including the United States, is situated or constituted by overlapping diasporas. Hence, the continuous formation of African diasporas through migration is one way in which the dispersed have remained linked to Africa. At this juncture, I find it necessary to reassert the importance of movement, mobility, migration, combined with the awareness of the world at large beyond locales or specific geographies to any positive articulation of Afropolitanism. In this regard, enacting Homi Bhabha's notion of vernacular cosmopolitanism comes in very handy. We must think of cosmopolitanism as a state of constant becoming, which cannot be fully realized in the present. Rather, we should seek cosmopolitan lessons in other cultures or other cultural contexts outside of European intellectual history. This will help us usher new models of global citizenship marked by the ability to be at home anywhere, an ability that always might become the burden of having no home whatsoever. This open ways of living at home abroad or abroad at home, realizing that homelessness is also real or as well as metaphorical. I want to conclude with Bob Marley's reggae. It is his, actually, sorry. I don't know how to play I want to conclude with Bob Marley, since his 75th birthday, on the 5th actually. Roots reggae classic, Exodus, of 1977, which draw on the biblical concept of Exodus to hasten the return of Africans scattered in the diaspora. Babylon, as he called it, to Africa. The lyrics reveal reflexive awareness of the centrality of movement to the existence of global Africans. The artistic production and cultural practices of the so-called Afropolitans offer a fresh look at the continuing importance and changing practices of Exodus by giving a voice to a newly emergent diasporic movement of artists who remain connected to Africa. In that sense, the transient, mobile nature of the Afropolitan provide a sense of a circular rather than only unidirectional movement. That is basically Paul Gilroy. Like the old movement of Ja people, the new movement of the Afropolitan is not a one-way affair. Thank you so much. Sorry, I have a feeling that I took too long, as I noticed some people started moving around, getting anxious. So.
Hi. So, okay. So, how I'm supposed to do this? Okay. So I guess, both Sanjukta and I are supposed to be sort of like here to discuss sort of parallel developments that emerged in South and Southeast Asia since the 1980s. So actually I want to sort of start with this Sha'ir, right? It's a sort of like poem, and it describes the conditions of sort of our world, interestingly, which is pictured as a sort of like shipwreck. You know, it's from the 17th century by a poet called Hamza Fansuri, and it's a condition that he sort of like pictures as a sort of shipwreck, and it's a condition that the Sufis say can only be redeemed via fana, or the extinguishing of the sort of like self. So where is identity, I guess, in all of this, right? What is the sort of construction that can take form? Now, for Malaysian, I think, is there such a thing called as a Malopotanism? Oh, as my sort of like friend Rahel was sort of like cheekily whispering into my ears during Hassan's sort of lecture just now. I think if you think of this sort of like constructions, we also then sort of like thinking of this construction as something that is also able to sort of address the condition of the alien. And is the alien really a condition central to the pulse of being the human? And that's where I want to sort of like try to push, my response to, which goes to the next slide. Yeah, okay. Nadi Insan, right? I want to talk about it through this magazine. It's a magazine that was sort of published from 1978 to 1983. And if, I know how to work. Yeah. So, and for those of you who sort of like know the word, Nadi comes from the sort of Sanskrit word for pulse, and Insan is from the Arabic word for the human, right? So the human sort of like pulse. It's a very sort of like interesting magazine because it was published by the Institute of Social Analysis, which was called Nadi, which was called Insan, and it's a magazine that is broadly about the third world. So it sort of like interestingly brings together news from, it has comics and magazines about sort of like education or pedagogy in Guinea-Bissau, which is a sort of West African sort of like country, talking about, how pedagogy can actually be instantiated in that particular sort of like state using the comic sort of like format. And it also covers, it has a lot of sort of like graphic representation, sort of like graphic illustration on sort of like environmental sort of like issues and collecting these huge, larger environmental issues to the political economy. But for me, what's sort of like really interesting about this magazine, despite, alongside all these sort of like much more politically sort of like sound articles, are the fact that Nadi Insan also sort of like covered much more sort of like, it tries to sort of like engage on sort of like pop sort of issues, right? Popular sort of like cultural issues. So it was also a platform for the kind of like incipient kind of like cultural studies. And the cover itself is interesting because you have a sort of like, photo of John Travolta. Clearly, it's a sort of poster that was used to sort of like wrap around a mango. And in the inaugural issue itself, you have a review of Saturday Night Fever by someone who is sort of like titles his initials JKS. So I was, the review actually was, I think it was sort of like quite laudatory in terms of how it sort of like understood what the cinematography of Saturday Night Fever, but it wasn't so sort of like keen on what the values that it was promoting. In fact, I think it was quite harshly, it worded quite harshly how it saw it as a kind of like a neo-imperial kind of like product that was coming out of the United States and wants us to be very sort of like careful about the message they were sort of like trying to send, right? But I think the person who's actually took the photograph is sort of like interesting because the initials itself would sort of like suggest what his name is. And the person behind the photograph is actually this figure, right? His name is called Jomo Kwame Sundaram. I think the name itself is interesting because I want to sort of like unpack this. How would you even sort of like come up with a name like this, right? For those of you who sort of like are familiar with some of the sort of like each of the sort of like words in this string of sort of like names up on the screen, you would kind of like have a sense that, hey, it's actually a sort of like composite. It's an amalgamation of different kinds of like histories and traditions. Let me show you what. That's what I have up on the screen. Okay, so of course Jomo is sort of like in reference to sort of Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya. Kwame Nkrumah, sort of like from Ghana, and Sundaram comes from the sort of like family name who is sort of like from Tamil Nadu, and also he is sort of like he's a child of the marriage between a Chinese and a sort of like Tamil Indian, and it's this kind of like meeting of all these names and sort of like figures that is interesting to me because someone like this, the possibility of someone taking on such a name like this is from the 1950s in Malaysia, also signposts a period in which Malaysia would have something like a Congo village, and you go to places like Cambodia, it's where you would have a Stalin sort of like avenue. It sort of signposts the different kinds of like imagination, the different kind of like sort of alliance making that is sort of taking place during this period of time that is very different from what you imagine the world is today. So as I was sort of like making fun of a name like sort of like Jomo Kwame Sundaram, I think one of the things that my mom sort of like told me, if you make fun of someone else's name, you should also sort of like make sure you sort of like go back and discover your own sort of like name as well. And trying to sort of like understand where my name can become sort of like queer and funny is also, it reveals sort of like an aspect of, I guess, my history that is seldom sort of like talked about in the family, only because my father has become quite right-wing. So if you look at, so I go back to, so my name, Simon Soon. standard, typical, sort of like, very standard, very typical, sort of like, you know, Christian, Chinese, middle class sort of like name, yeah? And if you go by the Chinese sort of like patriarchal sort of like records, you have the Zupu, which is the ancestral record. Normally you have all the male names sort of like listed down in it. Women are of no consequence within this sort of like system. You have that sort of like record of your mom, but she's always sort of like, you know, the women in the family always sort of is something that you marry out. So it's a very sort of like heavily patriarchal sort of like system. So it's not the Sun that I'm sort of like interested in. It's actually the Simon. You think that that's just a normal sort of like Christian name. But as I found out, my father had a very different sort of like past. I was named after the son of a former slave. And it was in 1979 when Roots, the next generation sort of like really took off in a big scale, that my father was inspired by this figure called sort of like Simon Alexander Haley, who was the father of sort of like Alex Haley, the author of sort of like Roots. And he was, you know, the son of a former slave and sharecropper, but later became a professor of sort of agriculture in the State Agricultural Mechanical Institute for Negroes in Alabama. First aired in sort of like February 1979. I guess sort of like bringing this up is also sort of pushing me to sort of think about looking at names as possibility, sites that allows for a possible, it's a possible site to think about the kinds of elective affinity you want to make. I could sort of focus on the Sun, which is that sort of family name that sort of like bears the tradition of all this sort of like patriarchal value. But I also feel very strongly that there is this other sort of like possibility out there. And to remember that, okay, my dad had a different sort of like past, and that this past is not yoked to this rising kind of far-right nationalism that has sort of like governed so much of our sort of like nationalist imagination today. And to be able to make this kind of elective affinity, to think about the possibility that it could sort of like engender, I think that speaks to the continued possibility of a kind of cosmopolitan in our present-day society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, Introduce myself. Okay. Well, my name is Sanjukta Sunderason. I'm a half historian, half art historian, and that will show in what I say. I live and work in the Netherlands, where I teach, and I couldn't miss seeing your closing slide on with the wax cloth with people wearing the. It's funny because when I go to in the Netherlands, it's known as African batik. In Chateau Rouge in Paris, it's known as, do you want Holland textile? Do you want Holland textile? You know, ours is cheap here, you should buy the Holland textiles. So that's one. And when I speak to my Southeast Asian colleagues, they say this is all batik, this is Southeast Asia, right? So, so talking about cosmopolitanism and material culture sometimes speaks louder than what we do. Yeah, so in terms of responding to Afropolitanism and what Salah has been talking about, and we spent a lot of time this morning to talk about how can we develop connected questions, even if these questions don't come up with stable answers. Connected questions between historiography of art in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa. And we are in the process of thinking about these questions. And thinking about the idea of Afropolitanism made me think, the first thing that came to my mind is that the demand or the need to be visualized as a singular continent, as an entity, whether that is real or not, if that's an imagined entity, the relevance and the import it has for Africa is most certainly not the case in Asia, for a start. And there are historical reasons for that, and one can go into that. And today morning, Simon, you were talking about Patrick Flores's point about the archipelagic imagination in Southeast Asia, and that made me think of what kind of regional imagination do we in South Asia have in terms of art? And what you end up with is a realization that we actually don't have any. We have not been able to come up with connected historiographical, connected conceptual questions that can help us imagine the region in a particular way. And that's a challenge worth pursuing as scholars, to ask why that has not happened in art history writing. However, that has happened in curation, that has happened is happening in curation. So that's some of the points I wanted to kind of flag right at the start, that there is a disjuncture in this collective imagination for South Asia, for which, so my response will be based on South Asia. So what can we take from the idea of Afropolitanism and respond to that from the particularities of South Asia? One point would be the very idea of cosmopolitanism and going back into the genealogies of that cosmopolitanism. So I wanted to talk about something else, but I've now taken down notes and I'll reflect on some of these points. The idea of cosmopolitanism, of course, it's tied to being in the world, but it has the echoes of being citizens of the world, right? It echoes a sense of sovereignty, an identity that is here and elsewhere. We spoke about Membe's idea about this awareness of this imbrication of here and elsewhere, this both. So the self is constantly at stake in that, right? Now, there are, of course, long durée histories of cosmopolitanism. We can go back, into the 15th century for all I care. But in the context of the conversations we are having here, I felt that 20th century histories of cosmopolitanism become very important. And such ideas developed in colonized countries through alternative forms of affiliations. Affiliations to anti-imperialism, affiliations to communism, affiliations to anti-fascism. That's the history of the 20th century. And their South and Southeast Asia, both as colonized people, have very strong histories in that. And many of these things are being talked about in scholarship now, but not enough. Or work is just coming out more and more. But to me, the idea of being in the world that cosmopolitanism points towards is something worth thinking about, and how that being relates to the post-colonial condition. What does being in the world, the arrival of political modernity through independence, and the political sovereignty and cultural sovereignty have been seen as two different things. And so the arrival of political sovereignty in colonized or post-colonial South Asia raised these questions of what would a post-colonial cosmopolitanism look like? What should post-colonial cosmopolitanism be like? And there have been echoes of interwar kind of anti-imperialist, anti-fascist kind of echoes and solidarities. But the arrival of the nation state actually is marked by this tension between forming the self first. So in a way, histories of cosmopolitanism have been overshadowed by this understanding of what should the nation, and you are aware of this in different contexts, but in India, for instance, the idea of Indianness, what is Indianness, what is Indianness? And then it goes on and on and on. And that is something that defines the 50s in a particular way. That's something that defines the 60s in a particular way. And you have artists who then depart from this whole conversation by then either seeking a pure abstract form that can be free from the demands of tradition. So I was asked to reflect on the 1980s, and I wanted to talk about the 1980s, but there is, to understand the 1980s, it's very important to understand what were the preoccupations of the 50s and 60s. And what is Indianness? Being Indian was an important part of that. The first disjuncture comes in the 1970s. Why does it come in the 1970s? Because for the first time in India, at least, there is a crisis of the nation state. There is a crisis of the faith intellectuals had in the nation state. And that is quite something, because a certain kind of criticality did not emerge in India in the 50s and 60s because people were fine with the Nehruvian nation state. There was a close entente between the government and the cultural the social elites, but also the cultural modernists. That first disjuncture comes in the 70s, and you see a lot of discourse around political art in India, you will see is clustered around the 1970s. I oppose it in my work, but the point is there's a reason why that's happening, and that's because of the declaration of national emergency in India when the democracy suspended for 2 years. And that is when you have artists and critics beginning to look at what is this relation between the national and the modern, right? And how do we make sense of this disjuncture? The 1980s actually to me is very significant, though in my work I don't cross the 70s, so it's actually quite interesting for me to think about the 80s in that sense. Is the first decade in the post-emergency era. What does that do? It releases artists from this pressure of thinking about Indianness, because there is a kind of disenchantment, one could say, around the idea of the nation. And to me, what is important in thinking about cosmopolitanism and what we draw from, where we place ourselves, the 1980s, I think, offers this very interesting moment when artists are entering into a kind of a very different terrain of the nation, where they are not trying to prove that their art is Indian, but they are thinking about how to deal with the history of India, right? So it's a kind of abstracted dialogue of the artist with inherited history. And that history can be that of the received traditions, that history can be that of recent decolonization, that history can be that of the failure of the momentary failure of the nation state, the momentary failure of democracy in the 1970s. 80s is also very interestingly placed at, and this is the historical hindsight offers these perspectives. The 80s is also placed as this unique period when artists are confronting the idea of secularism. And not assuming that as a given part of a progressive national identity, but a crisis that emerges out of the crisis of the nation state. And considering India would turn right-wing in the 1990s, I mean, it's nothing compared to now, but still, it was quite something in the 90s, and that is something artists had to deal with. So, John, if you can put the... So the point about the 80s, and I thought I'll just highlight some of the tendencies in the 2 minutes. Some of the tendencies in the 80s where this negotiation of history became very apparent. So many of you might be aware of this already, but first was the Place for People exhibition in 90. I'll just briefly mention these things. Place for People exhibition where the whole idea of the human figure was brought back. Not to talk about an allegorical way about the nation, but deeply subjective narratives of artists that would relate to the gender question, that would relate to the question of citizenship, that would relate to the question of alienation, actually, also. So that's one. The other artist I wanted to highlight is the sculpture that you will see, is that of an artist I was talking about in the morning, Meera Mukherjee in the 80s. Yeah. Huh? Only one slide. Is it coming? Yeah, it doesn't matter. So Meera Mukherjee in the 80s, again, not only does she bring back some of her experiences of working with indigenous tribal communities in the 50s and 60s, but she takes that idiom and roots it to very, very contemporary concerns. It could be a labor strike, it could be, you know, like the buses of Dhaka, people, you know, hanging on to buses, and that kind of iconography of tribal labor with that content. So it cannot come, is it? The slide? Two other artists are very important thinking about the 1980s. One of them is Tayyab Mehta, whose work you see there. It is part of his Mahishasura series. So an artist who goes back to mythic icons, but picks subversive imagery from mythology to bring back the question of violence, of decolonization. So in a way, given, and that happened in poetry in the 19th century. In art, it took the 1980s to kind of bring that imagery. So it's very interesting to think about this vis-a-vis M.F. Hussain also. So this is the mythic, the mythic figure of Mahishasura, the demon, who's being brought into a kind of foregrounded as a protagonist, struggle, the narrative of struggle. And the last one you actually have displayed somewhere here, not this particular print, but this genre. It started in the 70s, Shomnath Hore's work on the wound, which is again the artist confronting the history of decolonization. And not only that, relating this moment to, and we are talking about cosmopolitanism, relating this to Vietnam, relating this to Bangladesh. This was started in the early 70s, and relating it to anti-imperialism at large. So to me, the 80s and the 90s introduced this moment where the artists in India are actually freed from the nation state, I would say, in one way, and being able to use that history for newer kind of transnational kind of goals. I'll end here briefly, but we can. Thank you very much.
What I can do is just to add a few things, actually, in response to Simon and Sanjukta on the questions or parallel issues that they raised. On the issue of naming and the few citations that you had from the journal, I'm very pleased with the explosion of literature on thinking about South-South relationships, which is really interesting, because that's in pursuit of North-South research, and people try to theorize modernity within that framework. There is this axis of South-South has been forgotten. And I think the new research on Lotus magazine like the one that you cited, point to the richness of these interactions, of things that happen in the South. For example, I cited the Mbari Club because that is where Jacob Lawrence, Ibrahim al-Salahi, many others, like Dennis Williams from Guyana. So there is a lot of things that happen at that, but they were not well researched. There are few even shows or interest in the work, and the research just began. But it's pointing to interesting possibilities. On the issue of naming, it's interesting when you get into that, you will find that at that time, because that was a time of decolonization, South-South solidarity, the Afro-Asian solidarity. There's the Afro-Asian Writers Association, which was behind Lotus. Artists like Faiz Ahmed in Beirut, meeting Edward Said, and many interactions that happen. And if you go through Lotus magazine and other similar magazines like Transition in Uganda, you will find lots of interesting stories about how many of these artists now, or writers, we study as individuals, we forgot this rich history of the South-South relationship that they had. And these people are cosmopolitan, not because of North-South, cosmopolitan, because they also navigated another world with different. But it's also interesting how these magazines, I'm not sure if Insan is one of them, that it is the time when the United States and the CIA and those associations start funding this, and it's really resulted in crisis. Hiwar magazine in Beirut, which ended up to Yusuf Sayer, I'm not sure about the first name, but Sayer definitely is the last name. The editor who actually serialized in that magazine the famous novel and many other novels and poems by very important poets today, ended up being accused of being a CIA agent. Transition, later on, people found that is also funded. But that, as I argued, is that it never really changed the nature of the content of that. It doesn't change that for me. Because at that time, perhaps people innocently didn't know, perhaps there is, presence of American cultural centers, and that in and of itself is interesting to study, because there are now new studies about how the State Department, the CIA, deliberately sent people like Louis Armstrong and many others, jazz musicians, African, to many parts of Africa. And so the motive is mixed. Partly to promote America, partly the appeal of blackness and so forth, but it's also the rise of the civil rights. So there is a liberal agenda mixed with national defense agenda. So it's a bit complex. But this is the beauty of what's happening now in terms of research. In terms of the 80s, yes, it may be the rise of the collapse of, or the beginning of the crisis of the nation states. But it's also a beginning of something else. Of course, artists enjoyed a lot of freedom. For example, in Egypt, there was a lot of patronage, or good patronage by the state during Nasser's time, that left a lot of institutions that basically at the end relegated to just major buildings, like museums, opera houses, and so forth. They continue to produce, but then artists in the 1980s, 90s started to leave these formal institutions and form their own, but then entered something else. Galleries and people who are mostly from the West entering into these spaces, and then there is the funding by, that continued by cultural centers. But most interesting is, of course, in the issue of funding, that also comes with its own agenda, is the rise of what I call NGOization of the art scene. In the absence of the state patronage, and in the absence of culture of a local, or native philanthropy, something else took place, or displaced everything else, which is the dependency on funding from abroad, which is project-related, with its own agenda. Sometimes, of course, the art production has its own life anyway. I mean, you put an art in an exhibit, whether you frame it curatorially or not through a theme, the artwork will take a life of its own. So many artists emerged out of that kind of scene and became very well known, especially in the case of Egypt, South Africa, and places like that. I think it is interesting to study the 80s because it's also the rise, the beginning of the crisis of the nation state, the era of decolonization, the rise of military coups, nationalist government taking consolidations through the one-party system, becoming totally oppressive, like Jomo Kenyatta, who was an inspiration, at some point became the most horrible dictator. Mugabe is one example. Nasser himself, despite what he accomplished and the courage that he had in confronting the Israeli, French, American invasion at the eve of the nationalization of the Suez Canal, was also very brutal to the left that actually supported him. And he benefited from that actually, their impact in the history of Egypt. So he ended up alienating a whole strata of people. So that is combined with lack of interest in democracy by many of these liberation movements that took power in the independence or the post-independence era. So things have collapsed in the art arena, and new types of complex art scene that emerge. Partly also the destruction of many of the art institutions because of the privatization and lifting of, or removal of subsidies that was forced on those estates as a condition of funding from I know for sure in Sudan, the College of Fine Art that graduated people like Salah Hassan and Kamal Ibrahim Ishaq and many others who were supposed to become really well-trained, amazing artists, that collapsed completely because of the lack of funding from the state and the absence of any other forms of funding. Anyway, I thought these are just some observations that I find interesting in what you said. Thank you.